You should be getting the hang of how to mix layers in Core Graphics Drawing now. In the previous challenge, you used Core Graphics to provide the contents of the layer. You could have used CA text layers to provide the numbers and transformed those layers, and either of the two approaches would work. My personal preference is to break down a design into what I think are layers that could be animated and what I think are static images. In this video, we're going to break down and design a graph. We're going to look at how to draw gradients into a context and also how to draw text. The next video will contain a more challenging challenge where you'll finish off the graph from this video. This will use all the things we've learned about paths and transforms and put it all together in a practical application. We're going to find out what day people can come to our office party to avoid empty seats. We'll build a dynamic graph that will depend upon the data we get. Let's analyze this graph. First of all, we have text on the left to show the levels. We also have lines going across for each of those levels. We have data points drawn on the graph. And we have a gradient, but it's not covering the whole area, it's clipped by the graph points. One way of approaching this would be to use layers, so a shape layer for each of the lines and a CA gradient layer with a mask for the gradient. When drawing static images like this that aren't going to have animation, I prefer to use Core Graphics and build up the image, and often use context transforms instead of working out CG point positions. You already know how to do most of this, but let's take a look at how to draw Core Graphics gradients and how to draw text into a context.
Let's open up Preview.Storyboard and Graph View. I've already set up the graph data with the 7 days of the week and the number of people that can attend the party on each day. I've also set up the hardest part, which is working out how wide columns and rows and margins are. I've also set up a couple of methods to break up the long drawing code that'll be in DrawRect. So in DrawRect, let's get the context and call the gradient method. Drawing a Core Graphics gradient is very similar to drawing a CA gradient layer. However, you can do more with a Core Graphics gradient than you can with a CA layers gradient. You also have to specifically create the locations and colors and start points. In addition to this, you also have to specify a color space. Most of the time this will be standard RGB, red, green, blue. But if you're doing a grayscale gradient or a special print run in a PDF, you can create a CMYK color space or a grayscale. But if you're doing a grayscale gradient or a special print run in a PDF, you can create a CMYK color space or even a grayscale color space. So let's set up the standard RGB color space. I'll create an array of the colors needed. I've set up a couple of colors in the Assets catalog. So open up the Media Library. And we're going to use RW light blue and teal blue. When we initialize the Core Graphics gradient, it requires the colors array to be a core foundation array or an Objective-C NS array. Now let's create the locations of the colors. We'll have full pale blue at location 0 and full darker blue at location 1. Remember, the values go between 0 and 1, so it doesn't matter how big the area to fill is. And let's create the gradient. We'll set up the start and end points for the gradient. And finally, we can ask the context to draw the gradient. We'll make that implicitly unwrapped. You can see that it's more long-winded than a CA gradient layer because you have to spell out all the options. However, there's one reason why you might want to use a core graphics gradient. CA gradient layers can only do linear gradients like this one, but core graphics can do radial gradients. Let's comment out the previous gradient and have a look. A radial gradient is a round gradient, so you need a start center, a start radius, and an end center and an end radius. And draw the gradient. The gradient is round and starts at 50 points away from the center of the view, that's the start radius, and ends at 150 points away from the center of the view, that's the end radius. I'll just change the properties so you can see how you can be a little bit creative. This almost looks like a three-dimensional shiny bowling ball with a highlight. We'll reset the gradient as you'll need it for the challenge. Now we'll draw the text axis labels on the view, and then you'll be set up to draw the entire graph. One of the hardest things about drawing graphs is the layout. This is how I want to lay out my graph. I want to draw 5 y-axis labels for the graph down the left-hand side. These are going to be an averaged value for each label. I want top and bottom margins and the left and the right margins. So all the lines will have a gap of 1/6 of the bound's height with a gap at the top and bottom margins. I've already set up these values that we'll need as properties at the top of the class. So let's set up the text for the first axis label. Each label here is the calculation of the y-axis label. It's an average of the data in the array. I've set up a stub function down here called drawText, which we'll call from drawRect. The text has to be an NS string to be able to draw it. We'll set the attributes of the string, that's the font and size. Let's translate the context down by the gap at the top. And draw the text. As we're translating the context down, we'll always be drawing at y = 0. And that seemed to work, so I can draw this 5 times. And now I have to work out what the text should be. It's this value multiplied by the index. Unfortunately, these labels are upside down. 0 should be at the bottom and 10 should be at the top. So I'll change that. And there we go. We don't need this line anymore. That's set up the axis titles. One last thing I have to remember, whenever I translate a context, I should save and restore the context state. So I'll do that outside the for loop. You'll draw the rest of the graph in the next challenge, and that's where you'll draw the lines across and the data points.